As we go through using experiments as a tool to find the truth about our growth model and user psychology, we're on analyzing experiment results. In the last lesson, we walked through the question, when should you call the end of an experiment so that we can avoid the number of false positives and false negatives? We talked through 4 different methods of standard statistical significance, continuous monitoring, sequential sampling, dynamic decision boundaries, and their pros and cons. Once you call an experiment, we of course need to analyze it. The key question here is, how do you extract the most learnings out of every experiment? Analyzing the experiment is how we learn about our growth model and user psychology, but in practice, typically less than 25% of all experiments produce a success, meaning that it improves the variable that we are targeting. But that doesn't mean that we've necessarily failed within an experiment. An experiment is only a failure if you failed to learn, because we use failed experiments to help navigate to success. We use the analogy of a battleship game where we throw out experiments as different shots to learn, but once we find an area of success, we hone in and double down on that area. So in order to extract the learnings from the experiment, whether it was a success or a failure, we go through 3 levels of analysis. We start with success and failure, accuracy, and then try to understand the question, why? Let's talk a little bit about success and failure. Here, we're answering the simple question, was the variation a success or a failure? Did it improve our target metric or not? In addition to that, we need to make sure we ask the question, what happened to our trade-off metric? So when we went through defining our minimum viable tests, we not only defined a success metric, in other words, the metric that we're using to declare whether the experiment was an improvement over the control or not, but also the trade-off metric that we want to make sure that we monitor in order to understand the full results of the experiment. We gave the couple examples of increasing the number of ads within the LinkedIn feed might hurt retention, or increasing the number of signups from Facebook ads might hurt activation rate. So we need to look at both sides of the coin, the success metric as well as the trade-off metric, to determine whether or not the experiment was a success or a failure. We can massively improve our success metric, but if we see our trade-off metric decline substantially as well, we might say that that experiment is a failure. In the second step of analysis, we assess the accuracy of the results compared to our prediction. So in other words, we're trying to answer the question, how accurate was my upside prediction? So when we went through and defined our minimum viable tests, we made a prediction on the upside around the success metric. We want to understand how close or how far off we were. If we're really far off our prediction, that's an indication that we might not fully understand this variable in the model or what's driving this variable in the model. So we really need to understand, if we're really far off, there might be some additional things that we want to dig into in order to understand what is really causing what within our growth model. The third level of analysis is asking the question, why? This is the most important step. Just determining whether an experiment was a success or a failure isn't enough. We want to try to understand, why was it a success or a failure? This is where the learnings come from. Here we're trying to understand what are the potential reasons. It's almost impossible to come up with an exact reason, but if we're able to come up with a number of potential reasons, we're able to get more learnings out of the experiment. We can try to figure out the why in a couple different areas. We can first break the experiment into pieces. In other words, look at all of the different inputs into the success metric. What was the cause of the effect? Was it a specific input metric into that success metric, or was it an improvement across all of those different inputs? We should also segment in order to figure out if the experiment influenced different audiences at different levels. We can also look at qualitative data either on an ongoing or post-experiment basis, as well as run additional experiments to validate new hypotheses that we might have around the why for this experiment. So these are the 3 levels of analysis that you should go through: success and failure, the accuracy compared to our prediction, as well as trying to come up with potential reasons for why an experiment was a success or failure. In the next lesson, we'll talk about how do we apply and communicate the experiment learnings within our organization.